I know you're here for the shocking part. The courtroom twist where I pulled a deed from my jacket like a magician pulling a rabbit from a hat, and 96 homes suddenly stood on ground that never belonged to them. We'll get there. But before I tell you how it all unraveled, you need to know the story of the land itself. Because without that, none of this will make sense. This wasn't just dirt and grass. It wasn't just acreage on a map with a dotted border. This land was my childhood, my inheritance, the one piece of history my family had held onto through generations of storms, recessions, and promises broken by everyone except the soil. My grandfather worked this ground with his hands cracked and bleeding. My mother tended it like it was her child, and when it came into my possession, I swore I'd protect it. I never thought that promise would be tested the way it was. The first sign of trouble came one spring morning, quiet as a whisper. I was driving back from town, groceries on the passenger seat, when I noticed something strange on the far edge of my property. Survey flags, bright orange and yellow, fluttering in the breeze, stabbed into the earth like foreign invaders. At first, I thought maybe the county was running new lines, or the utility company was planning an expansion. But the flags multiplied over the next week. By the time I walked out to investigate, I found survey markers with numbers, chalk lines cutting across the field, and men in hard hats walking the land like they owned it. I remember standing there, groceries still in the truck, watching a stranger measure my soil with a clipboard in his hand. My stomach twisted with confusion. I asked, politely at first, "What exactly are you doing here?" The man barely looked up. Subdivision development. The HOAs building new homes. I laughed. Actually laughed, thinking he must have made a mistake. "This is my land," I told him. "You've got the wrong place." But he didn't blink. He handed me a map, and to my horror, there it was, 200 acres of my family's property shaded in gray, labeled as Phase 2. According to their paperwork, my land wasn't mine anymore. I didn't sleep that night. I turned on every lamp in the house and spread old deeds across the dining table, tracing signatures that had faded to sepia over time. I had the original papers, signed by the county clerk, stamped with the official seal. My name, my grandfather's before mine, all there in black and white. There was no doubt in my mind. We had never sold this land. We never would. But the next morning, the bulldozers rolled in. The sound of machinery ripping through the earth I had played on as a child was like a knife in my chest. Trees came down like soldiers in a war. Fences I had mended with my father were torn apart in minutes. I shouted, I waved papers, I called the sheriff. But the deputy looked at me with wary eyes and said, "Son, they've got permits. You'll need to take this to court." A court? As if that was something a man like me could afford. Weeks turned into months. I watched 96 homes rise out of the dust, frames stretching toward the sky, roofs hammering into place, driveways poured like veins across the land. Neighbors stopped waving at me. The HOA president, a man with a pressed suit and a smile that never touched his eyes, told me it was too late to fight progress. And maybe, to anyone else, it would have been. Maybe they thought I was just some stubborn old landowner clinging to the past, powerless to stop the machine of development. But they didn't know the whole story. They didn't know that in my safe, in a fireproof box, was something no one else had. Something that would change everything when the time was right. So, I let them build. I let them pour every ounce of money, every brick, every shingle into those 96 homes. I let the driveways harden and the families move in. I walked past the construction each morning with a steady face, though my heart broke at every nail driven into my family's soil. They thought my silence was surrender. They mistook patience for defeat. But I was waiting. Waiting for the moment they would least expect. Waiting for the day I'd walk into court with a deed older and stronger than any paper they had conjured. And that's exactly what I did. But before we get to that day, the day everything turned upside down, you need to understand what it cost me to wait. The friendships I lost. The sleepless nights. The gnawing doubt that maybe I was the crazy one, maybe I had imagined my right to the land. Chapter 2 will take you into that storm. Because justice, when it finally came, didn't come cheap. And when I tell you how it ended, you'll understand why sometimes the greatest revenge is simply holding your ground. Literally, the weeks leading up to the trial were some of the loneliest days of my life. Imagine standing on your porch, staring at a sea of rooftops, where once there had been rolling fields, oak trees, and silence. The laughter of children echoed from backyards that technically belonged to me, yet felt stolen. Families were planting flowers in gardens dug into my soil. Mailboxes, lined in perfect rows, marked addresses that never should have existed. Every day, I was reminded that I was one man against an entire homeowners association with money, lawyers, and power. They mailed me letters, dozens of them, mocking legal threats telling me to vacate their subdivision. They even fined me for keeping abandoned equipment on what they claimed was community property. That abandoned equipment, my tractor, the one my grandfather had driven before me. Friends told me to give up. What are you gonna do? Fight 100 families? Some asked. It's too late, and sometimes, late at night. When exhaustion and grief pressed down on me, I almost believed them. But then I'd unlock the safe. I'd hold that deed in my hands, tracing the ink signatures of my grandfather, the county clerk, and the notary's stamp. It was real. My bloodline was carved into that paper. And I knew then, I wasn't fighting against families. I wasn't trying to evict children from their beds. I was fighting the lie. I was fighting the greed that had allowed an HOA to believe they could steamroll one man out of existence. The courthouse smelled of dust and polish the morning my case was finally called. I sat alone on one side of the courtroom, my tie a little too tight, my palms sweating through the fabric of my jacket. Across from me sat a row of attorneys in sharp suits, their briefcases lined up like soldiers. Behind them, the HOA president lounged in the front row, legs crossed, smirk painted across his face like he'd already won. The judge entered, and the room stood. When he took his seat, the trial began. The HOA's lawyers moved first. They argued confidently, flashing glossy maps and documents stamped with recent dates. They claimed their permits were valid, that the county had approved construction, and that I was mistaken about my ownership. They painted me as a relic of the past, a bitter landowner clinging to nostalgia while progress marched on. I listened in silence, my stomach tightening with every word. Their voices were smooth, persuasive, and for a while I could see even the judge leaning forward, nodding slightly, as though he, too, believed their story. Then, it was my turn. I stood, clearing my throat, clutching the fireproof folder that had never left my side. My voice trembled at first, but I steadied it, remembering the promise I had made to my grandfather to always protect the land. Your Honor, I began, I have here the original deed to the property in question. Signed in 1954, notarized and recorded with the county clerk's office. It has remained in my family ever since. This land has never been sold, transferred, or surrendered. The paperwork presented by the HOA is built on false assumptions, or worse. The courtroom murmured as I placed the aged document on the judge's desk. The clerk handled it delicately, the ink faded but legible. My grandfather's name, bold and steady, glared back at us all from a different era. The AA's attorneys objected immediately, their voices sharp. This is irrelevant. The county approved our permits. But the judge silenced them with a raised hand. He leaned over the deed, examining every detail, every signature, every stamp, his brows furrowed deeper with each passing second. Then, he asked the clerk to retrieve the county's historical property records. What happened next felt like the world shifting on its axis. The clerk returned with dusty ledgers and official scans. One by one, they confirmed my claim the land was still legally mine. The so-called Phase 2 subdivision had been built entirely on a false transfer, pushed through by developers and rubber stamped without proper verification. The judge sat back, sighing heavily. "This court cannot ignore the validity of these records," he said. "The land belongs, and has always belonged, to the plaintiff." The words dropped like thunder in the room. The HOA president's smirk vanished. His lawyers scrambled, whispering furiously, but their fortress of paperwork crumbled to dust before the weight of a single authentic deed. For the first time in months, I felt the ground solid beneath my feet again. Not just metaphorically, but literally. But here's where the story twists. You might expect I ordered all 96 families to leave that very day, reclaiming my land in full. I could have. The law was on my side. But when I turned to look at the rows of faces in the courtroom, mothers clutching their children, fathers shifting nervously, young couples who had just begun their lives, I saw fear in their eyes. They weren't my enemies. They had been misled just as much as I had been wronged. I took a long breath, then addressed the court. "Your Honor, I don't wish to evict these families. They built their lives here in good faith. But I do ask that the HOA, and the developers who profited from this, be held accountable for their actions." That decision didn't come from weakness. It came from strength. The kind that comes when you realize victory isn't about destroying others, but about restoring what was stolen. The ruling that followed was historic in our county. The developers were ordered to pay damages, millions of dollars, for illegal construction. The HOA was dissolved, stripped of power, and forced to relinquish control of the subdivision. And me, I retained legal ownership of the entire land, with binding contracts that each homeowner would now pay me directly for the plots their houses stood on. In one stroke, the court returned dignity to my family's name and punished the greed that had tried to erase it. Walking out of that courthouse, I felt lighter than I had in years. Reporters swarmed, neighbors whispered, and the HOA president disappeared into the shadows where he belonged. But none of that mattered to me. What mattered was the soil beneath my boots. The same soil that had carried my grandfather's footsteps, my mother's care, and now my own hard-won justice. Today, I still walk that land. I still tend to the edges where the fields remain open. Sometimes I hear children laughing from the subdivision, their voices mingling with the wind that rustles through the old oaks still standing. And instead of bitterness, I feel peace. Because the truth is, land is more than property. It's memory. It's identity. And when you stand up for it, when you hold your ground, you prove something greater than ownership. You prove resilience. So if you've ever been told you're too small to fight, too late to act, or too powerless to win, remember this: sometimes the greatest justice is letting the storm pass, then showing the world you never let go. And that, my friends, is why I let them build. Because the deeper the roots of the lie, the stronger the truth grows when it finally breaks the surface.